This is Macro Analytics, delivering frank conversations on global macroeconomics and market analysis, outside the mainstream, featuring discussions and debates between Gordon T. Long, publisher and editor of GordonTLong.com, and his guests. The content of this discussion is strictly the opinion of the participants. It is in no way a solicitation for business, nor is it to be considered investment advice of any sort. Always consult a registered investment advisor before making any investment decision. These discussions are extremely hard-hitting and terribly frank, and parental discretion is advised. Now, on to the show.
Good morning. I'm Gord Long with GordonTLong.com, and I have with me this morning Charles Hugh Smith, very well-recognized writer on the web, certainly no stranger to our long-term listeners, who is the publisher of the website of twominds.com. Welcome back, Charles.
Thank you, Gordon. Always glad to be here.
It's been a little longer than our usual month period. I know you had some relatives visiting. I hope you took some time off.
Did a great drive through Northern California and Oregon. I would recommend it to anybody who can pull a few days off and go visit the redwoods and the Oregon coast.
Charles, I have a chart up here that we did part of our abstraction process back in 2008 from our tipping points, and those colored boxes along the left are all the tipping points we track, about 32 to 38 of them, and they may move up or down. Sometimes we add a new one, but generally they're pretty consistent. It allows us to kind of take them and start to group them. And some of the things change to the right. They move around slightly, but you can see that even going back that many years from that chart, a lot of these things have unfolded. We were talking about currency wars and financial repression back then, as what we saw on the drawing board. But down at the bottom, we were talking about expecting regionalization, resource shortages, emerging markets becoming a big issue as there was a West-East conflict. And then 2 years ago, we wrote on statism as we saw unfolding, and it's just absolutely coming to bear. And I know that some of the things you wanted to talk about here this morning of instability, fragmentation, resource wars, absolutely, to me, just add meat to that chart of saying, yes, it's starting to unfold as those tipping points were suggesting.
No, I think your work has been absolutely prescient, Gordon, and in identifying these primary dynamics which end up in tipping points, then I think you've done a great service, and in a way, everything that we're talking about can be found in your what I call your master diagram. And but let me talk a little bit about the sources of instability. And I've identified a few here, starting with failed states. And I want to just speak a little bit about how there's two kinds of failed states and failed governments. One is in the developing world, we tend to see weak institutions and corruption. And this is and a failure of the government or the state to take care of the people. And this is we can find this in North Korea, Venezuela, and Pakistan, and various other Mideast nations. But then there's a whole other set of developed world failed states, and I didn't list those here, but we can mention three reasons why even the developed world governments and states are failing. One is the failure of the central planning model. And this, of course, we tend to think this is only in communist countries with 5-year plans and so on. But of course, the United States has been plagued by central planning itself, and so is Europe, and so is Japan. So central planning model is failing in the developed world, and so is the neoliberal model of capitalism, which claims that markets regulate themselves, and what, as you've often pointed out, what that leads to is crony capitalism, where the concentrations of wealth end up controlling the markets and the regulations imposed by the government, and so that's a failed model. And then we've got the long supply chains of the global economy, which are really under threat here as we get regional instability.
Exactly. The net of them, to me, Charles, on these failed states is obsolete economic models. The models that they were based on have obsoleted themselves, and that is the underpinning. They maybe were an agricultural economy, they were manufacturing oriented. Well, the manufacturing shifted and the supply chains have shifted, or the economies of the agriculture no longer allows the economy to support itself at an increasing standard of living or whatever. So there are change that's trying to happen, and the governments haven't got a solution, and then they force themselves to either print money or do unnatural things that cause even bigger kinds of problems. And, you know, Venezuela, we've clearly seen it. North Korea is only a matter of time, and we can go on with the countries. The number that are failing, at the rate they're failing, I don't think we've ever seen anything like this in 100 years.
No, I think that's a very good point, and we can go back, as many other people have, to the pre-World War I era, which saw a lot of fault lines kind of holding together and then crumbling under the pressure of open warfare.
Charles, actually, that's a really good observation, because, you know, pre-First World War in 1849 was where we shifted fundamentally from what they used to call the sovereign states, that is, monarchies, controlled all of Europe, controlled most of the world, with few exceptions, the United States being one of them. But then we went to the nation states, and so as a nation states, democracies started to come into being. In general, a lot of exceptions, and so I think we're moving into another era of major change structurally, where even the nation state is going to be obsolete. We've already seen the emergence of regional areas. The EU is an example. BRIC countries forcing themselves together, open free trade zones and this sort of thing, which are precursors to really the obsolescence in many ways of the nation state.
That's an excellent point, Gordon, and it's interesting that what you just described is actually two dynamics which interact. One is the fragmentation of nation states, especially those which were assembled by imperial diktat, such as Iraq and Syria and much of the Mideast, that it totally ignored religious and tribal divisions. Those nations are not going to survive in their current form, I don't think. But then you also point out that there's other regional forces that are obsoleting the nation state.
Precisely. The problem I see with these ones is they didn't put together common belief systems. People don't come together unless they have a common belief system. And so it's pretty hard for the Sunnis and the Shias to live together, or the Kurds, when their core belief in Islamic fundamentalism is different. How do you create a country and have them come together, especially when there's no separation of church and state? There's going to be a natural evolution, and, you know, we're seeing this ISIS integration starting to appear, which bridges the borders of Syria and Iraq in creating another nation state. This evolution of the fragmentation.
And another force that I mentioned on the next slide is the divided loyalties of states that are bordering or have loyalties to both East and West. And, of course, the current example is Ukraine, which sits smack dab between Western Europe and what we might call the Eastern Bloc of Russia and states loyal to Russia. And we can find examples of these kinds of states with multiple loyalties, or they're sitting on geopolitical fault lines, and so those are intractable in a way, because you're not going to be able to settle that except through enlightened self-interest and a very long process of diplomacy and as you say, it's finding shared values and shared common interests, and that's a long process.
They're typically solved by war, but I hope that's not the case this time. But they're going to be solved by financial warfare, because at the end of the day, it's going to be who gives, in the Ukraine's case, the most amount of money, most amount of financial support. Conflicts are being fought differently, even in the East-West kind of divide.
Yes, Gordon, I think that's an excellent point, and we can talk about the way that resource wars, which I know you've discussed many times over the years, are also reflections of fiat currency wars, because you can only buy resources if your currency is recognized as a store of value. So, and to my mind, resource wars and currency wars are two sides of the same coin.
I actually think the biggest issue is going to be resources and the fight and the conflicts that are going to come out of all elements of resources. People don't understand, to me, the severity of water issues, the severity of the food pricing. Most of these global conflicts that we're finding in the countries, what started when in Egypt, etc., we go through them. It's and even Ukraine. It stemmed initially by food prices going up, which was creating real pressures on people, and then that forced itself into the political discussions where their parties weren't helping them. The problems with the basics, that and shelter, are a lot of these are subsidized. So, for example, in Egypt, the United States' subsidies that we were handing to Egypt was helping keep food costs dramatically lower than they otherwise would have been. When we slowed and took away that subsidies, it was only a matter of time before we had massive political unrest. And by the way, you will see that commonality right across the board. So a lot of it goes back to either subsidies, foreign aid and foreign support, shifts in the currency, and the currency starting to shift, or energy prices changing. It continuously the same kinds of pattern.
Right, and your chart here shows that food prices and crisis go together.
One of the most common things you will see is the relationship between crisis and food prices. People will put up, Charles, with corruption in their government. They'll put up with inequality and unfairness as long as they're feeding their family, they have shelter, and they're getting by. But when they don't have food and they feel unsafe, that's when they revolt. That's when they go to the streets. And food is the first thing that will force them out. That's why countries will do anything to keep the food prices. Unfortunately, food prices around the world are really starting to skyrocket.
And what are the foundations of food? It's water, which is scarce, and energy anymore for industrial production of food. Then you need cheap energy. So as water and energy become more expensive, then food has nowhere else to go but up.
Charles, people need to understand too, in the United States, we take cheap energy so much for granted that if energy went up, our food prices would go through the roof. I call it the $1,000 salad. How we move so much food across the country based on cheap energy costs. If we had to pay normal energy costs that other countries it would change our country dramatically. I was just in Paris and Vienna, and I was paying $11 to $12 a gallon U.S. for gas. If I said that to most Americans, they'd say, pardon? Why is it that we should have gas and oil so much cheaper?
Right. And it raises another issue that we've want to talk about, which is you've called the globalization trap. And it's related to the currency wars and insolvency and the long supply chains. In other words, if somebody grows a bushel of wheat in the United States and they can sell it for 3 times more overseas, then why should they sell it at virtually no profit here in the States? And so we have a global pricing of these resources, and that's another source of instability. And the second source of instability we've talked about many times, which is if you print money, you haven't printed wealth. And so governments around the world are trying to buy resources ultimately by printing money. And that doesn't, that leads to, an instability of the whole monetary system, of the debt system, and of the currency.
The liquidity that we're pumping out at phenomenal rates, that's not wealth. And wealth is what you need for collateral to borrow. And the system itself is not creating enough wealth anymore. And our debt structure is so heavy. And the payment on that debt is now larger than the rate at which we're creating real wealth. And we're camouflaging it with liquidity. So effectively what we're doing is we're counterfeiting. And we're counterfeiting money to accept so that we can get the resources to keep things going. We, in fact, are in a matter of insolvency, though countries are never effectively insolvent as long as they can print their currency until, in fact, you have a currency crisis. And that's usually where it ends. You end up with a currency crisis. Except this time, Charles, we have a world that's in fiat currency, all fiat currency. So this time it won't be a country's currency that fails. It's going to be major regions in globalization. It'll be the first time that we've ever seen it on that scale.
Exactly. And so the consequences of that, we can go back to your master chart, but that these sources of instability destabilize these regional currencies and regional trade areas. So that's part of what we're seeing here is the contagion of instability, and also the intractability of these sources of instability. That they're not going to go away on their own. It's not a problem that can be solved because these are structural, systemic sources of instability. And the instability caused by the erosion of purchasing power due to money printing and the issuance of credit, it impoverishes entire nations and entire regions. And that's what we're seeing with Cyprus and Greece. And even in the developed world, when you destroy a person's currency or the currency that people have to use, then you basically deprive them of wealth and impoverish them. And they have to spend whatever they have for these basic resources, and there's nothing left for the consumer society that our so-called prosperity is based on.
The whole element of financial repression, you can see up here in the higher end of this chart. Years ago, a few years ago, a lot of the issues we had were on the top of this chart. Currency wars, financial repression, as I just said, but they were centered out of debt, and they have not gone away. They've just got larger. But what's happened now is these issues we're talking about now are becoming larger. The social issues, the political issues, not just the financial issues. And so at the bottom here, this regionalization we mentioned, resource shortages, the issues we're seeing in emerging markets. We just had a crisis there last year, and it kind of was saved sort of the day, but that's to come back. The whole issues with how the value is being created, and of course the West-East conflict up here, this power shift that we labeled. So this is where it's at right now. And this year we put our thesis paper on the globalization trap, where we really believe what it means is that total aggregate demand is not growing at a fast enough rate. We've got a large population, we've got overcapacity, but we have a shrinking real disposable income. We're almost killing the golden goose. That is the middle class that buys and consumes. The earnings are no longer there, and it's because the debt overhang is consuming all of the real wealth that in fact is being created. So this squeeze is reducing demand, and you're seeing it in earnings. The companies are showing earnings, but there's no top line growth. The top line growth just isn't there. And if it wasn't for the unbelievable levels of corporate buybacks that are just simply out of sight, Charles, to the extent of like $1 trillion in the last 2 years, and corporations such as IBM, where they're borrowing $6 or $7 billion to be buying back $14 billion worth of share. You just go through all of these corporations. We'd be tremendously different financial position. It's being covered over. It's part of this, I'll use this word, counterfeiting, that's effectively going on. But there's a globalization trap, and it will show with liquidity and collateral problems, and eventually we'll have the fiat currency system will have to be revalued. I don't want to use the word collapse, but we will have to reset. And that's going to be very painful. But it's coming.
Very good summary, Gordon. And I think if I had to summarize your master diagram here, we could say that it's the confluence of monetary, resource, and political crises, that these are all interlinked. The monetary counterfeiting that you described then makes it more difficult to afford the resources people need, and that creates social unrest and political crisis.
Charles, as negative as this can be, actually what we need to recognize is that it is change trying to happen. It's the world trying to move to another level. And it's always painful, and it's disruptive because people don't want to give up the status quo. Generations ago, they used to have jubilees where debt got so large we had forgiveness. If you've done any of your history, I'm not saying we're going to forgive debt, but our debt overhang is just out of sight, and we have to somehow reset it. But the powers to be are not going to want that debt reset, right? So conflict has to happen, and what should come out of this is a better world. Unfortunately, what happens when there's conflict and change, sometimes the people that grab powers are not the right the people take us in the wrong directions. And that's the frightening thing that we have to be very, very concerned about going forward. Final comments, Charles, as we wrap here?
We see the outlines of a better alternative, and what you termed a global network that relies on open source, trust, decentralization, and self-organizing systems that rely on enlightened self-interest and trust rather than on force.
That's where we're going. That's what's in the future, but it's going to be a rocky road. I think this roadmap is a pretty good one, and it's held us in pretty good stead. We're here 5 years, but so we'll see what it looks like over the next year or two. Charles, all the best, and we'll see you again next month.
Okay, thank you, Gordon.
Thank you, Charles. Bye.
This has been Gordon T. Long, editor and publisher of GordonTLong.com. New recordings are posted regularly and can be found at GordonTLong.com. New show notifications are available through RSS feed, iTunes, and other social networking venues at GordonTLong.com.